Hi folks, welcome to another episode of The Hole on the Corner. I'm Dan Peterson, aka Dr. Proctor, and we are in this episode concluding our coverage of Lafferty's short story Snuffles from 1960. We are going to respond to Alzabo Soup's 2-episode coverage of this on their podcast, which is a Gene Wolfe podcast, in case you're just tuning into this third one, where they normally discuss the works of Gene Wolfe, as you can imagine, but they're taking a break, looking at cosmic horror, and decided to use Lafferty's Snuffles as a unique example of that, which is a very cool take. So, we are going to be playing Alzabo Soup, Hole on the Corner, Bingo, where I'm just going to mark off the things that we both said. Let us proceed then. I want to say that these guys, listening to them cover this, and I've been listening to their podcast for a while, and I knew this about them, but hearing them cover the exact same story that I spent 2 episodes covering, I was reminded, these guys are smooth operators. They've been at this a while, and they've got it down to a really nice little patter. But yeah, so, kind of reminded me of how far I have to go and kind of figuring out a way to do this a little more smoothly. Anyway, so to begin with, I just want to say that I do welcome more critical engagement with Lafferty in the sense of like critiquing Lafferty or, finding fault with Lafferty or, just having a little bit harsher of an opinion of him or what have you. Alzabo Soup certainly approached him critically, like looking with the tools of criticism, at Lafferty. But they were just so enthusiastic, and it was just such a pleasure to hear them enthuse about Lafferty. I didn't know they were Lafferty fans, but clearly they already enjoy him. And one of the things they said was that, to begin with, was that Lafferty, quote, wrote hundreds of beautiful, shocking, profound, really exciting stories. So that's just cool. So they begin with a couple different parameters of sort of generally looking at Lafferty, which was very cool, kind of contextualizing him a bit. Since they're a Wolfe podcast, they start with just saying, here's the connections between Lafferty and Wolfe. And they note that both just so happen to be conservatives, Catholics, engineers. They both served in the military, Lafferty in World War II, Wolfe in Korea. But in spite of these very interesting similarities, they were quick to note they're not the same person, just not the same person as people or writers, though there are tons of similarities and sort of overlaps or connections, resonances. So they're interesting to look at that way. They said that Lafferty's works are incredibly rich in a way similar to Wolfe, yet they're very different in execution. And so that's the cool thing that I've mentioned before, and I was a little iffy on mentioning it, that I think Lafferty has a similar level of layering and complexity and mysteries and to some degree puzzles, although different than Wolfe, but in his work. And I think that is the reason that's a tricky thing to say, and we'll get into this a little bit based on what Alzabo Soup says, is that Lafferty has a deceptive simplicity to his prose. Now, there's times where he's in lyrical flight and he's known as a stylist, and you see that coming through. Even in those times, I'd say there's a colloquialism to it, a quote-unquote lower register, what have you, that can deceive you as to the level of literary complexity going on in his storytelling, in his syntax, his prose, and so on. But he is, comparable to Wolfe in that way. So it's cool to hear them say that. Now here's what they say, that though, quote, Lafferty is working at a level of style as high and intricate as Wolfe's, we really see how his unique voice gives him an entirely different feel and field of interest. And that voice is key, they say. And I like that phrasing, that it gives him a different feel and field of interest. And that's true. There's a different feel to how Lafferty writes, and there's often a different foci or various things that he's looking at, this field of interest. Although, again, there's lots of resonances. But they talk about Lafferty's voice and how that's key. And they go on to say, quote, he doesn't approach storytelling in what we would consider a traditional way at all. And at the same time, it's very traditional. So what they mean is, of course, that he doesn't follow so many of the contemporary conventions of writing that we have in modern and postmodern and contemporary writing. And at the same time, one of the reasons for that is because he's drawing on older traditions, particularly, as they note, he borrows techniques from folk tales, fairy tales, tall tales, legend, and mythology. So bingo. that is something I also mentioned and always mention about Lafferty. And also, of course, we need to bingo that they said that there's a connection between Lafferty and Wolfe. And I forgot to mention that they started out their whole 2 episodes having a chat about Cocaine Bear and how it was weird that they happened to be covering this story as that movie was coming out in the cinema. And I mentioned Cocaine Bear. Going on, they also say that Lafferty is not so concerned with plot, and as they say, quote, some device moving the story forward. Bingo. And here's how they put it, quote, things happen, but they're secondary to the conversation about what's happening. I think that's really interesting. I've talked a lot on this channel about, or I've mentioned it frequently, that there's like extensive philosophical conversations in Lafferty's fiction frequently, both in the short fiction and in the novels. And I also mentioned how I find these like really colorful and scintillating and as exciting as the action. The only thing I would say is that what they're saying here is that it's not always true that it's more about those conversations than the action in any given story or even novel. And that's why I rated, when I did my first little group of videos on the novels, I rated them as either a rant or a romp, because there was a tendency to have more conversation in some and less in others. But anyway, it's still something we both brought up and is interesting about the way Lafferty writes. Now they make this interesting connection and distinction with Wolfe, where they say that where Wolfe makes allusions, right, to mythology from antiquity, Lafferty, on the other hand, borrows rhetorical devices from antiquity, okay? And that's where that sophistication that Lafferty has isn't always immediately recognized, right? Because he's not doing that, you know, what is a very overt form of sophistication in the likes of Wolfe, and you see it in Cormac McCarthy, and you know, you name it, you know, Toni Morrison or whoever, great writers, you know, where you kind of allude to older traditions, to antiquity or whatever, and especially in Wolfe, you know, just so much reference to Greco-Roman, ancient Greco-Roman things and what have you. And you may not always catch all the references or what they mean, but you're kind of getting that pretty overtly in reading Wolfe, and it's in a style that shares in some of antiquity's eloquence or what have you. And whereas Lafferty is more inhabiting those older styles and just bringing them forward into his fiction and using their rhetoric, rather than saying, you know, he will mention, you know, things from antiquity quite overtly from time to time. And even then there's a humor to it that belies the sophistication. But also, he's just kind of writing like these older writers and drawing on quite a few different traditions in that way. So that's a very astute observation from Alzabo Soup about sort of a difference within a similarity in Wolfe and Lafferty. And they also, again, emphasize that Lafferty has this, what they call a homespun voice, and that they say feels like oral storytelling, which is something I've mentioned that a lot on this channel, and that he genuinely comes out of an oral storytelling tradition on the Oklahoma frontier with his uncles and father. And they say it's like oral storytelling that you hear around the campfire or at the bar. They say it feels rural to them. And they say it's like hearing SF ideas presented by a guy in a rocking chair on a porch, which is a very cool way to think of it. However, it's interesting. Homespun is not a word I would personally use for Lafferty. There are elements and moments that are very overtly rural, but overall, I wouldn't call Lafferty's voice particularly rural. It's aware of that and it brings that in, but he's very much a city, urban writer. He lived in the city all his life, and he likes cities, and he constantly is referencing major American cities and not well-known cities and so on. So he does have that earthy thing coming from, you know, familiarity with agrarian life and what have you, but he's still quite an urban writer. And I do think he sounds like somebody telling a story at a bar. That's the main thing for me. Or drawing on his own sort of autobiographical material, where he says that his uncles and dad owned a shop front, a store, a supply store out on that Oklahoma frontier. So there's no real, town built up yet with anything else to do, theater or what have you. And so people would hang out at the store and swap tales. And he called it a mixing bowl of storytelling because they got people from all over the states, all over different kinds of walks of life, and mountain men and Native Americans and what have you, traders and the homesteaders and so on, with different sort of forms of storytelling coming through and just like mixing it all together, swapping tales, trying to top each other with tall tales and what have you at this store. So I picture him more in that mode when I hear this raconteur voice in the storytelling. I picture it a little more like that than homespun and rocking chair, and they use grandfatherly a lot on Alzabo Soup. And I know Lafferty is, he calls himself the cranky old man from Tulsa, and there's all these, photographs of him. He's this old guy, right? So I get why you'd picture that, but that's not really how I ever hear him in my head. He is, there's a stentorian quality often to his characters' voices and his narrational voices. He himself was very soft-spoken. In my opinion, my impression of him from hearing him, seeing him, reading everything about him, and so on, is he was a very quiet, shy, bookish wee guy, wee soul. He's this sensitive, bookish kid and then man who observed all these other larger than life characters and could write them and could inhabit them, and his narrational voices inhabit them. And that's more what I get from his type of storytelling. But hey, fair enough. It's interesting to hear people say he's like a grandpa on a rocking chair telling the grandkids a story. But interestingly, he's the old man, right? But he never was a grandpa. He didn't have grandkids. He never married. He never had kids. So that we know of. Who knows if Lafferty sowed his wild oats? Well, he did on some level. He said so. He said he took up writing to stop. Well, how does he put it? Too much drinking and fooling around, whatever fooling around means. Or getting into trouble. I can't remember exactly how he puts it. Now, related to this notion of traditions and storytelling, they note, of course, that he sympathetically draws on Native American and First Nations history and concerns. So we've got another bingo. And this, drawing on Native Americans comes from his familiarity with his Native American neighbors, co-workers, and so on in Oklahoma. Now, Alzabo Soup remarked that this was actually unusual in this era of SF to hear this like a white Catholic man in central USA having a sympathetic view of Native Americans. Now, I have no idea of the accuracy of that. I would guess that that's true or somewhat true. That would have been my impression of that era, but it's interesting to hear them say that. So it'd be interesting to hear what people think of that. And I will say in this regard, sympathetic or not, okay, so I think people like Le Guin, Ursula Le Guin, and to a much lesser extent or more mixed and maybe problematic extent, people like Zelazny or Ellison or whoever, maybe Delaney. I'm not, Delaney's probably closer to Le Guin in this, I would say. But they would want to write a sympathetic view of indigenous peoples, and I think they do in their fiction. However, I think it is from that sort of Western colonialist perspective that says, not the wrong kind, the post-colonial perspective that says that recognizes the crime, okay, of subjugating, annihilating a people and their culture and so on, and that sees the beauty and the worth and the dignity of those peoples and their cultures, including hopefully up to today. I think that kind of attitude is there in Le Guin and others and New Wave writers, some of them who care about this kind of stuff, not that all that many people care. Here's the difference I see in Lafferty. Lafferty, to me, from what I can tell, was more of an insider. Okay, I feel like some of these other writers are outsiders to this, looking sympathetically in on it. Lafferty, I think, as an Irish American who was very connected to that Irish ancestry, and partly through his Catholicism and his background and his upbringing and so on, he looked at his Native American neighbors and talked to them and lived life with them and felt like we have something massively in common here. We look at the universe in a similar way. You know, maybe not exactly the same, but there's strong overlap. Neither of us have that sort of colonial Western, you know, rationalistic or what have you type of enlightenment worldview, really. We're doing something a little different. We're drawing on older traditions, but living them in the now, in the modern, and interacting with that, and so on. So that's the difference I see with Lafferty there, and I think it's always worth remembering that. Now, their other opening gambit about Lafferty is to discuss Lafferty and cosmic horror. And they mentioned that, you know, their main impetus in choosing the story was just to get some Lafferty on the show, which is very cool. And what they say is that they reckon all of Lafferty has some cosmic horror at the margins, which is an interesting comment, and I think I agree. You see a lot of that. And they talk about how in his stories humans are buffeted by larger sort of cosmic forces, right? And that even though the humans think they're so important, they find themselves to be, in Alzabo Soup's words, inessential. And that space intelligences have this like callous attitude toward humanity often in Lafferty's stories. Okay, and then they say there's this recurring space exploration goes wrong story, and that's very true of Lafferty. Now, the only thing I would say there is just that this is part of such a bigger discussion, so I'll try not to get into it, but when humans have to recognize that they are a lot, like radically less significant than they realized in the cosmos through cosmic horror and other means, there's this tendency to go, so it's shown that there's a cold indifferent universe and humans don't matter in the scheme of things. That's a huge leap. That's interesting. I get it. You know, there's a grand tradition of thinking that way. I understand that leap. I, you know, sympathize with it greatly. I really do. However, I don't think that's Lafferty's leap, nor is it everyone's leap who comes to this conclusion of our radically diminished place in the universe if we see things as they are, if we get a grand enough vision. I would say that Lafferty's characters have to face the challenge of recontextualizing themselves into something so much greater, rather than going, oh, well, nothing means anything, you know, type of thing. And that the space intelligences or whatever, is it that they're callous, or is it that just the inevitable thing that happens when sort of incommensurable beings come into contact, and sometimes one is in some ontological sense greater than another to a degree that they can't hardly see the ontological significance of the other. So, you know, we say, you know, they see us as insects or whatever. True, although you have to interrogate how you're viewing insects then. But anyway, so I think that, you know, this does happen a lot in Lafferty. Let me name some stories where it either happens, as they say, just like in the margins, just for a moment there you see it, or it's more central to the story. But the transcendent tigers, the ultimate creature, land of the great horses, been a long, long time, all pieces of a river shore, continued on next rock, boomer flats, novels. I think that The Devil is Dead deals with cosmic horror in an interesting way, but, you know, Past Master, Arrive at Easterwine, Fourth Mansions, humans are constantly being challenged to like be integrated into like, whoa, things are so much, like things are big and mysterious and complex to a level that is terrifying, that is baffling, but it's not necessarily that therefore any one thing is somehow insignificant. It's that things are going to overlap in ways that will involve bloodshed, perhaps, or other kinds of horrors or terrors, or just deep challenges to what it means to be human or what it means to exist. And it's important to note that in Lafferty, this comes as much through a vibrance and exuberance in the life cycle that may involve bloodshed or the grotesquerie or the monstrous on some level, but it's not sheer bleakness or gloom. It's often just being integrated into something kind of terrifyingly exuberant. Okay. And now they also mentioned that in their minds, cosmic horror itself often manifests as a reaction to a fractured present. A reaction to a fractured present. That's very hard to say, is how they put it. And they're saying that Lafferty, like Wolfe, has this conservative view, but to say that he's conservative doesn't really capture the breadth of his thinking. This is what Alzabo Soup says, and I'm glad they made that caveat. Lafferty shows a present that is problematic and a past that was better. Let me come back to that. But they point out that that past that was better is often an indigenous one rather than a colonialist one. So that's an interesting wrinkle there on the idea of like thinking the past was better. And I guess I would say that there are things he loves in the past, but there's a lot of things he loves in the present too. So I think it's that he's saying the past kind of in a Faulknerian way, is saying that the past isn't really gone, it's with us, it's haunting us, and there are good things that we're trying to forget that we should recover from the past in the present. And, you know, again, that's not just sort of a colonialist conservative view all the time. There are lots of native thinkers that would say, hey, you know, as Vine Deloria titles his last work, The World We Used to Live In, it's important to remember these things and to consider how they might still be with us and how we can interact with traditions and things in a contemporary way. For example, I'm going to cover this in my next video as sort of a last minute celebration of Pride Month, but this book, Love After the End, and its subtitle is An Anthology of Two-Spirit and Indigiqueer Speculative Fiction, that has that feeling of the past being present with us and in the future and having to be reckoned with, even as we, you know, pursue so-called progressive, you know, liberative politics and these kinds of things. So, you know, recovering the past or seeing a fractured present and seeing good in the past, you know, is complicated, is all I'm saying. But yeah, they say that in Lafferty, humanity is trying to contend with ideas that are bigger than them and out of scope, and that's very true. They also see echoes of Gene Wolfe's The Book of the New Sun in Snuffles, which is really cool, and we'll come back to that at the end. So in part one of the story, first of all, they say they wish they could just read the whole thing because it's so good. And I was very gratified that they read out, I'm pretty sure, as many passages as I read out. It's just something you want to do with Lafferty. It's like, it's there. It's like, here, listen to this. That's all you need, you know? Now, they pronounced the planet as Bellotta. Now, I said it was Bellota, or since it's a Spanish word, Bellota. But I like this Bellotta pronunciation. I don't know why I didn't even think of that. And I forgot to mention that Bellota gives me senses of bloat and bellows, which I think kind of work with things in the story and the bear and that kind of thing. But Bellotta also kind of works, makes me think of blot, ink blot, and a creator, creating things. So I like that pronunciation too. Now they note that, like I did in a way, though I don't think I've got that one on here for bingo, but that, you know, Lafferty doesn't give SF explanations and do the normal world building. That's how he works. But they did find this story hard to place in genre sense. Like they noted that a lot of Lafferty's stories could be called fantasy of a sort, you know, that it's fantastical in the way it works, but they were like, this one, I don't know how to, if it's science fiction or even science fantasy. And I do think there's a possible reading of the story that sticks strictly to science fiction. But even as science fantasy, it's a little, it's hard to place. It's almost like space fabulation, if we want to use it SF, or science fabulation maybe, I don't know. But I like that they were kind of confused by that. So like me, they went right through the cast list. They actually read the whole thing out. And they said how it was, there's like showmanship in the narrational voice at this point, like a carnival barker, but one who's quite eloquent. They pointed a lot more than I did into details of Lafferty's poetic, evocative, metrical, even cadenced sort of prose style in a lot of moments of the story. And like me, they pointed out how this actually works as characterization. It's skillful characterization that creates empathy with the characters, and in some ways works better than at least some versions of show don't tell. And it really made me think. I was like, that is so true. Sometimes show don't tell can be tedious if it's not well done. But Lafferty can do it the other way around and just tell and actually get that same kind of work done in good ways. They also mentioned Lafferty's compact style, which I mentioned. And I love what they say here. You know, I mentioned how it's like folk and myth and stuff, and how it really makes these compact descriptions really stay put, and they kind of work as like tokens that almost expand in your mind. And what they pointed out was that it allows our imaginations to do the heavy lifting, which is so cool. That's absolutely right. That is what, at his best, that is what Lafferty does. And what they didn't mention, but that's worth mentioning, that this does connect to Wolfe, except that Wolfe does this in a more elusive way, where our imaginations build up the world because he keeps hinting at what's going on, giving us very colorful, vivid touches, but that don't tell us enough that we then fill in. And Lafferty does the same with vivid, colorful touches, but whereas Wolfe is elusive, Lafferty is more concrete, I think. It is quite interesting. And I mentioned that, the philosopher Graham Harman said that Lovecraft has a cubist approach to describing his monsters, and that Lafferty does something similar in a different way. And I almost wonder, could you say that Wolfe has this more impressionistic way of getting our imaginations to do the heavy lifting, and Lafferty has a cubist way? I'm just sketching, I'm just riffing and wondering about that. But they point out how, too much description of this kind can actually end up looking cartoonish on the page. It just becomes unbelievable and dumb. And I've seen a lot of that in science fiction. So it's a smart move on Wolfe and Lafferty's part. However, it's funny that, Lafferty often draws on the category of the cartoon and the cartoonish, and he's referencing, drawn cartoons and comics and that kind of thing. And he even says in this story at one point, instead of describing the trees, he just says they don't fit our categories, they're not deciduous and so on, and they looked like trees that were drawn by a cartoonist or something along those lines. And I love that. So he actually uses the cartoonish to get our imaginations to do the work, and it actually does work. It's like weird, and as I said, it's quite trippy and stuff. Now, Alzabo Soup mentions in relation to this that this story wouldn't work as, say, a 1960s Star Trek episode. And many writers of this time, science fiction writers, were writing those episodes. And you couldn't do that on, you couldn't show Snuffles and this whole weird planet on a Star Trek episode. It exceeds that. I would say that's probably true of the current Star Treks as well, which I keep trying, and I bounce right off them. I hate to say it, but I am more of a Star Wars person than the Star Trek person. Of course, by which I mean the original Star Wars trilogy. Not because I don't like anything new. It's just this new stuff is not good. It has its moments, but yeah. Fight with me if you want. Anyway, but it did make me want. Now, you get these discussions in Wolfe and Lafferty communities. Can they be adapted to the screen? Big screen or small screen? Who should do it? And we all know in both cases, and this is true with like Cormac McCarthy as well, it just shouldn't be done. It can't be done. Don't do it. And yet we want it so bad. We want, and we're gonna cry when it happens, if it happens, but we just can't help but imagine it. So I thinking about Snuffles, I was like, wait a minute. What if Alex Garland did it? Just as a little mini-series, like Devs, right? And, Alex Garland did Annihilation based on Jeff Vandermeer. And I think Garland's aesthetic would work for Snuffles. He struggles with the CGI, so I'm not sure about that exactly. But he can really get that beautiful science fictional cosmic horror type thing going. So that made me wonder. Or what about this new series, Guillermo del Toro's Cabinet of Curiosities? Particularly, let's get Panos Cosmatos to do Snuffles. Just one episode. Oh my God. He does Mandy, and I'm in love with that film and his whole vision, and he did one of the episodes of Cabinet. It's the best one in the series to me. Again, I think it'd be tricky to show Snuffles, so here's where I want to dream that Del Toro himself gets in on it and brings out his sort of Pan's Labyrinth and Hellboy creature creation stuff and makes a Snuffles that we can actually enjoy. But it probably just shouldn't happen. Now, they noted that Billy, with his whole etymological flights and philosophical conversations, has a really spiritual disposition. He's kind of a spiritual character, which I hadn't really thought of before, and I completely agree with, and I think that's pretty cool. When it gets to the part where Hardy starts talking about his idea that we only die because we make a mistake, otherwise we wouldn't die, and they go, quote, "We're up to stoner levels of philosophy here." I love that. They keep joking about them being like stoners and stuff. Now, they went into this discourse a lot more than I did. They went into the whole death theme and the animal theme so much more than I did. And I love that. And it's worth listening to for that reason. I think they cover some good stuff in there. And one thing they said that I completely forgot to mention is that when somebody says if it's a mistake that makes us die, what do non-human animals do? What mistake do they make that makes them die? And Hardy says, pause for my dog, August. Hardy responds, the animals make the mistake of not being human. Now, I had forgotten that Hardy takes this kind of hard line of human exceptionalism there. And it's that to which Margie Cott responds, well, maybe there's no firm line between animals and humans. And then Phelan comes in and says, there's a definite line between us, and that whole discourse. So I'd forgotten about that with Hardy and just how that whole thing all meshes together, this death discourse, why do we die, how do we die, and the relationship between non-humans and other animals. But I will call that a bingo thing that we both talked about. August has decided to join us here. Speaking of animals, right on time, August. How brilliant. What a lad. And they say that part one ends with them living in this idyllic Garden of Eden. They use Eden and Edenic a lot, which I didn't totally see in this story, but I do see how it's, they kind of talk about it being basically a scientist's paradise, right? And they say that this planet with all its diversity and stuff satisfies all their scientific curiosity and gives them, as they say, those good high midnight vibes. And that's the way part one ends. And in part two, when most of the characters are suddenly killed, there is some bingo here in that we both talked about how, you know, they die and the character of how they die. But again, they focused a lot more on this and got a lot more out of it, how each of the characters, they die well or they kind of die poorly, and that's kind of one of the major functions of Snuffles, is to present this challenge to humans of how are you going to live with death, and are you going to face it, you know, with some kind of integrity or what have you. So it was good to hear them talk about that. And this connects to one of my sort of key themes that I see in the story, that it's a question of, will you play along with the cosmic joke that you don't know the punchline to? And I got into that at the end of the second video on that. Another bingo point is that they talked about the galaxy illustration of the giant bear and how that's not really what this story is all about. It's not what Snuffles looks like. It's not a story about being chased by a giant bear per se, but that it's a fun illustration. But they do note that in this shift in part two, that this is, you know, really where cosmic horror kicks in, because there's these two final characters who can only run from this, as they put it, monstrous, disturbing force or overpowering force that they have no way to defeat. Okay, fair enough. Now, when it comes to they start eating these narcotic plants and become hallucinatory, they're tripping balls, that in their reasoning about what's happening, is Snuffles talking to them, how to outsmart him and all that, as Alzabo Soup put it, they tried to make sense of a world that doesn't have rules. Now, I understand that impression, but again, I just want to emphasize that early on in the story it says that on Bayota, the law of levity conspires against the law of gravity, and I won't try to redo all that. You can go look at it, but just that there are two orders competing here. It's not that there's no rules, it's that there's rules they don't understand. Their current way of thinking is incommensurate with what they're confronted with. And again, I would say that, you know, this doesn't speak to meaninglessness, but to a meaning that is beyond us, that we might have the opportunity to rethink and readjust to. But they point out that part one had really set us up and showed us this innocuous and friendly and fun and entertaining planet and character in Snuffles, and how Lafferty uses not only the action of the story, but the form of storytelling to emphasize when this cosmic shift occurs. And as they put it, quote, from harmless, kind of cute bear thing to the literal monster that's going to end everyone's life. And as they note, if you see here that Lafferty can do a tone shift, well, he can do another one as he pleases. And they put it more succinctly, what I was trying to say about a phase shift in the story, or a swerve as they put it. So there's a bingo there. We both talked about how there's this sudden shift and then there's another shift. Now in episode 2, they get to part 3, the final part of Lafferty's story, and they talk about there being this property of cosmic horror where a character is unable to distinguish reality and fantasy. And they talk about it in a couple different ways, but part of it is that oftentimes a character in a cosmic horror story will hold that what most people take to be reality is just a comfortable fantasy that, at least for them, has been sort of accidentally pierced, through monstrous revelation or what have you. And they say that drugs often play a role in that, and I couldn't think of any examples, but it's probably in stuff I've read that I don't remember that there was some kind of drug element involved. But they say that Lafferty takes it further by making just like everything these characters have to eat is narcotic. And how, I love the way they're seeing how Lafferty just cranks it up on these poor characters. They point out that the characters who have no choice but to trip are scientists who are having their rational project undermined. And as Alzabo Soup puts it, quote, Lafferty is taking the one tool they have, that ability to clearly reason, right out of their toolkit. So yes, that's bingo too. Science and rationality problematized. And they're going to come back to this. Now, they also point out, and I don't think I got into this so much, but it's a really good point. Is this an unreliable narrator? Okay, because at a certain point, we don't know what's going on. We get conflicting ideas from Georgina and Brian, the remaining characters who are alive. And the narrator seems to be saying certain things are going on, though there's even a lack of commitment there. But by the end, it seems that the narrator is taking an ontological side to a certain degree. But they question, like, wait a minute, he's our only anchor, but, there's that raconteur quality. There's that, like, tall tale lies quality to all of Lafferty's writing into this story. So is there kind of a wink here, it's confusing. It's unstable in a good way. They point to how cool Snuffles' self-aggrandizing voice is and how this feels appropriate to how he would speak as a demiurge, or at least to how Brian imagines Snuffles would speak. And they note how when Snuffles has his thing about, why do you call me a bear because I'm in a bear suit? I don't call you a man because you're in a man suit, which is such a cool line. That he's problematizing their idea, or some of the characters' idea, that there's no soul in animals, and suggesting that soul, as they put it in Alzabo Soup, almost that soul's like something that has to be earned. And that they say that the characters are, quote, directly contending against nature, and Snuffles seems to be implying that there's some challenge or some merit that they have to gain before they can really be considered true people, end quote. And so this gets into that, how they choose to die, how they face death in this overwhelming reality. And then Alzabo Soup points out that even for the reader, quote, rationality itself seems unable to handle what's going on in this story, and at best can only come in at a cockeyed angle. And what would Billy Cross say about using that term? And yes, that's absolutely right. And that's one of the key points to the story. And again, I would point out how, they earlier on in the story, they said there's chemistry here. There's the building blocks of chemistry here, but they're off. So it's not that there's nothing, there's no structure, no rationality, but it's of an order that we can only begin to grasp in a cockeyed, off sort of way. And that's a really important live ideological debate and discussion that's going on to this day about Enlightenment ways of looking at things and other ways of looking at things, and whether rationality is king or science is king, or whether there are a host of approaches that can to some degree be complementary and mutually reinforcing if given their own domains and these kinds of things. So Lafferty is, really bringing up that whole discussion, and this story is quite relevant in that way. And Alzabo Soup says how complicated a simple bear chase scene has become. So true. Now, I forgot that there's this part where Snuffles says to Georgina that he could have killed Brian. He didn't have to knock him off the cliff or whatever. He could kill him anytime he wants by making, something he eats poisonous, or striking him with lightning or something. That he has this, that kind of godlike power over the planet. And Brian retorts that, well, then why doesn't he do it? And Georgina just says, well, Snuffles says he has his reasons, But that's just an added layer of like, what's going on here that I forgot to mention. And Alzabo Soup focused a lot more on the romance and the interhuman drama between Brian and Georgina and the possible sort of significance of that in the overall story's themes, and that was really good. And they talk about how Snuffles is like, the way Snuffles is written to sound, as they say, both innocent and angry at the same time, and how he's personally hurt by their critique. And that's the whole thing that I called sympathy for the demiurge, you know, that there's a sense in which he's one of the most sympathetic characters of the story. But they say that Snuffles just makes this planet at this point a hellscape for them. And there are, quote, constant revisions and reappraisals of literally every part of this story, and we can't land on anything solid. And again, this is a good quality of the story. It makes it rich. It makes it an exciting read and an exciting reread and discussion point. They also discuss Carnival, as I think almost anyone would looking at this story, and how Georgina kind of positions Snuffles as this false god or false king, an imposter, or a harlequin authority is the phrase that Alzabo Soup uses. And that is a brilliant phrase, and that's very accurate about him. But again, I want to point out that if she shows him as a false king, it's one that she's willing to play along with. She participates in the carnival. Brian laments that they didn't get to enjoy the carnival, but Georgina did to some degree, and she talks about how Snuffles shows up well as the carnival king, and you could almost believe that Snuffles created the world in time of carnival, that kind of thing. So it's complicated. She's playing along with him being carnival king, this upside down thing, this creator that's not omnipotent and omniscient. And that's something we both mentioned, that Snuffles is not an omniscient god. And they get into this really interesting theorizing, which is coming from their understanding of Gene Wolfe's Book of the Long Sun. And they say, quote, in order to move forward in whatever conception of godhood he has of himself, it has to be one that is iterating and improving as he continues this process of creation. So, you know, how does that work with, well, I'll come back to that because they're going to say something else about it. But yeah, I mean, the story does seem to indicate something like that. Now, they also talk about this relationship that Georgina and Brian are beginning to develop, and they have this sort of loyalty to one another where they could turn each other over to Snuffles, or one could flee so that hopefully Snuffles will chase the other, and they stick together through all this. And they question, does this give their characters sort of an integrity, a virtue, a validity that shows them to be, you know, people and meaningful and moral? And they say yes, they act morally and meaningfully. However, Alzabo Soup goes on to say that this is cosmic horror, so their moral behavior can't change the outcome. Okay, quote, it's another pointless expression that's being thrown into the void, end quote. And all their hope is unfounded, they say. As they say, quote, they've been running across an entire planet from a force that was never going to let them go to begin with, end quote. Now, you know, that's, again, it's like, there's so many things to talk about there, but the question is, you know, can you be meaningful and moral even in a meaningless universe? And those who embrace a meaningless universe, nihilists or whatever, some would say, yes, you can, and here's reasons why, and others would say, but that's undermined by your whole worldview, and then there's a response to that. So there's that question, but then there's also the question of, you know, is this a void, this unstoppable force, or is it acting moral in the face of something that goes beyond morality as we understand it, and is that meaningful? And I would point to, well, it comes up a lot in Lafferty, it comes up in Past Master, but Arrive at Easter Wine in particular, it has this cosmic vision at the end where they see like a horror vision of the universe where there's holes and everything and stuff. But then they realize that these holes, as they say, are sort of matrices. Like each one's a matrix. It's like birthing new things, birthing new worlds, and that kind of thing. And one character says, quote, we have gazed at it all wrong. We've seen only the dark after images, not the bright fire itself. You know, and that's something Lafferty gets into a lot, saying, yeah, things look nihilistic sometimes, but maybe that's actually only the beginning of the picture, and there's a light on the other side of that darkness, or you know, that's bigger than that, you know, or that these seeming holes are really points of growth or new birth. interesting to think about. And whether, you know, and this story does get into that with Snuffles saying he'll chew them together into something new. It's a very grotesque, you know, iteration of that, but it's something to think about. Now, we both talked about how Georgina kind of gives this response of when Brian says you're only a girl, no, she says no one's only in anything. And they really get into the feminist kind of potential of that. And it's really good, their discussion of that. But I'm going to count that as a bingo. I forgot to count as bingo that we both read out long passages. Now they note that it's a beautiful last paragraph to the story, and they're just like, what a story. This is okay, so here's where I will name them. Metz says, quote, what a crazy, convoluted, twisty, backwards, self-contradicting story, end quote. And, oh, excuse me, that was Phil who said that. And then Metz responds, Phil, take that narcotic berry out of your mouth. So, they say that this story ends in the same place that Gene Wolfe's Book of the New Sun ends. Quote, he was trying to be a good God, but he wasn't a good enough God yet. That's why he needed another chance. And they talk about him being like a petulant teenager God, and he's just like, give me a chance, I'm working up to it, or a toddler God. And I mentioned that in mine, but I haven't put that as bingo here. But they say that there's the same arc in the New Sun, in Book of the New Sun. And the sort of messianic element to Wolfe's Book of the New Sun involves sort of a task so difficult that it requires, quote, a multiversal possibility to find the one that is destined to do the thing that is necessary to perpetuate life, end quote. And, you know, big Gene Wolfe nerds will understand this interpretation of that whole story. I don't even know if that's maybe like the accepted interpretation of this, or if that's one of the many, many, many theories about how that story works. And whilst I have read Book of the New Sun twice, it's been a long time, and you know, I have a long ways to go in understanding that work. But yeah, I like that they connect it to it in that way and see Snuffles being something like basically Severian. But they say it's like God in training depicted as a monster. And I do think this is parallel in some strange way to what I said about Snuffles almost representing the process of evolution itself, like a personification of evolution, and the hardship of that slow rise, as it were, of evolving from one form into another in greater complexity and so on. And this is, you know, a Teilhardian idea. Teilhard de Chardin, the French priest and paleontologist, whom Lafferty hated, it seems. And we'll get into that later because that comes up in Past Master and Fourth Mansions. But Lafferty has sometimes weirdly similar ideas. And sometimes those are the people he goes at the hardest, people who are doing something similar to him, but he feels crucially off. And Alzabo Soup says, you know, was the death of our characters dignified? Did it earn them that distinction of being human as opposed to animal? And they say, of course, the story doesn't answer these questions or even come down on one side as to whether this was an encounter with the divine or the effects of drugs. And it's up to the readers to wrestle with, and that is true. The readers are required to engage, to participate. Again, Andrew Ferguson is the master of talking about this with Lafferty, how he is the very form and structure of his stories require us to participate in building his worlds together with him. Even though, as Alzabo Soup says, quote, we don't have anything to hang our hat on, end quote, not even the narrator's reliability per se. And they note that there's just, compared to a lot of cosmic horror they've read, they say there's so much more narrative sophistication and subtlety of craft and more philosophical conversation than they've found in other cosmic horror. So that's interesting to hear too, although I would like to hear if people think who are familiar with Snuffles think that they've heard, I want recommendations for cosmic horror that has this level of sophistication and, you know, philosophy and stuff. I would say some of Ligotti does have that. He gets crazy meta sometimes in his. But I would like to hear of other stuff if you have any recommendations. Now they close with two theories, two kind of opposite register theories they have about this story. And one is that instead of it just being a narcotic belt that they then discover is a narcotic season, that this is a narcotic planet. And perhaps that when they first landed, they were in the marijuana mellow season of the planet, and everyone's, you know, getting high and everyone's vibing and having a good time and spouting philosophy, and things turn manic, right, through the bear attack, and then the drug effect turns dangerous, and it undermines their philosophical positionings in the first part, and the themes of the untrustworthiness of rationality and the self-contradictory nature of existence come in, and that kind of thing. And they say, quote, "Grandpa didn't tell us they were on drugs the whole time." And that was something I got into in a slightly different way. I just said from the time they started ingesting things on the planet. I guess it's maybe the same thing. They were on drugs the whole time. But as to the greater themes of the story, they say you can take it on face value that they were having a divine encounter of sorts. But if so, this means that the story would suggest that gods can't be perfect on their first try. Even the holiest of beings have to go through a training process, they say, and that this is surprising from a Catholic author. But they say the last paragraph, with its emphasis on, you know, perfection is a very long, very hard road, because it says even in the new iteration that Snuffles will build, there's still some grotesquerie in it, and that this is about theodicy. This is about justifying how bad things happen to people in a universe presided over by a good and all-powerful God, and that the answer is that we're creatures who are part of these various iterations on the way to perfection, that there is a telos, there is a goal and end, but that it's not, you know, straightforward. And this is what I said, that it speaks to no pat teleology. You know, that Brian wanted there to be no pat ending, and so we can think of telos and teleology, that there be no pat teleology. And there is kind of a carnival vision of that kind of thing here, but that there is, in Lafferty's view, a beatific vision on the other end of that, and through grace and death, as Alzabo Soup say, we can participate in that ultimate divine reality. And does this justify suffering and evil? You know, people are very divided on, you know, whether these theodicies work or not. But they suggest that, I would say, I don't know that it's doing a theodicy and really like firmly suggesting that. I would say it brings up that issue and that realm of discourse, yeah, for sure, in a carnival way. But I don't know what to make of this whole idea of iterations and that kind of thing. And it's something Lafferty actually does mention quite a few other times. So how does that fit in? How is he putting Gnostic theology and Catholic theology and seemingly other things and maybe original things all together here? I'm still pretty baffled, but lots of interesting things to think about. Now, in closing, I just want to clarify just a few things that I said in the last video, I think, or in both videos. But one was that I quoted from Jung about sciences arising from our psychology. And I forgot to mention that I'm quoting Jung very critically. You know, I find him interesting, but I have issues, especially with his sort of universal application of ideas, that I think it can erase important difference in cultures and stuff. And that Lafferty, whilst he drew on Jung and engaged with Jung and found him interesting, was also critical. It was a critical engagement with Jung. So just want to point that out. More importantly and more tricky. Okay, this is so hard to talk about. So I mentioned that with Lafferty's emphasis in this story on multiplicity in the characters, in the species, in what Snuffles is and all this kind of, it's just this plurality and multiplicity. And then when Georgina says, no one is only an anything, that he was kind of being anti-essentialist before that really was massively on the radar. I mean, I think that did arise in the 60s, but this is 1960, and you know, I don't know that Lafferty was particularly part of any discourse like that. But yeah, I'm going to stand by that, and I think that's really in his fiction, that to say something is just this thing and nothing more, in essence, Lafferty finds problematic and problematizes all over and across his fiction. But let me try to thread that needle. I do think that Lafferty was a committed and consistent Aristotelian Thomistic thinker, so he would have embraced some sense of a metaphysics of essence. And from here, I started to look at things, and this was becoming a post-grad seminar that I would need to do much more research for to even present properly. So I've had to step back from that and go, no. Maybe another time. For now, just let me say that I wonder, is there a distinction between a metaphysics of essence on the one hand and colonialist essentialism on the other hand? And that latter thing is very important, and it needs to be critiqued. It is how genders and sexualities and races and so on have been oppressed and reduced and caricatured. And yeah, there's a lot of injustice based on that kind of idea. And certainly Aristotle himself has some pretty horrible quotes about women and men and stuff. So, but even feminist thinkers are still engaging Aristotle and wondering, is there something we can salvage here? And, feminist thinkers have sometimes wondered if there's like a temporary strategic essentialism, as they call it, that's needed sometimes to kind of, have some kind of focal point and consistency that can be acted from against injustice and these kinds of things. And, even, with Darwinism, it's thought that essentialism went out the window because, things evolved and there's no essence that a thing has to be. But people are working with that as well up to the day, talking about because essence also has to do with potentiality and actuality, very important ideas in Aquinas and Aristotle and Aquinas. But that there's like multiple potentiality in things, so that there's not just this one telos that things can grow to, so that the ideas of essence can still work even with evolutionary biology and these kinds of things. Even Timothy Morton, that I mentioned last time, Morton, who is a very, left-wing progressive thinker who's pro-trans and concerned about racial injustices and feminism and various things in his engagement with ecology, suggests in this book that we might need something like, as he calls it, a weird essentialism. So even he is still, thinkers like him are working with this idea of essence and whether there's something to salvage there. And I'm still trying to figure out what Morton means in this. It's fascinating because he really gets to the roots of philosophy and challenges the absolute fundamentals of sort of logic and the way we think in really productive ways. So his idea of essence I don't understand yet, but basically it's about presence and how we're not always present, and ontologically things flicker and shudder. And there's weird connections there with Lafferty. I think of Smo and the implicit clay and how the characters are said to be low resolution and they keep fading out and back in and stuff, But, weird essentialism, but some kind of, idea of essence that we might still be able to work with. And all I'm saying about Lafferty, right, is that his fiction seems to anticipate these tensions and these discussions and questions about being against a reductive essentialism about things and yet wondering if there is something there to work with about essence. That's all I'm saying. And I would say that in the same way that this story talks about there being, suggests that there's no pat teleology, it would say that there's no pat essence. Okay, that's my thing. In some ways I'd be happy to say that the story Snuffles is about there being no pat teleology and no pat essence. Okay, that these things may be real, but are complicated, mysterious, and to some degree baffling and overwhelming, but will we play along anyway? That concludes our crazy tour through the story Snuffles. There's still so much more to think about and say, but what's been great about this is it really sets us up. These are some main Lafferty themes we're seeing in this story. It's really going to set us up to do a read through of Past Master and to talk about everything else. So I think we're going to be able to, this is going to help us, just like really launch into like, here's some of the major themes in Lafferty and start tracing them out through all of his works. So let me know your views on Snuffles and the various ways we've tried to interpret the story, what you think, and we will see you again soon for some more content. So thanks, take care, and we'll see you soon.